Hello and welcome to our program, Where God Weeps, a program where we talk about the situation of the suffering church around the world. Today we're going to be talking about Magadan, a harbour town of 120,000 lying on the Sea of Okhotsk in the far east of Siberia, some 1,500 kilometres from the nearest city. Backed by the mineral-rich Kolyma mountain range, it is today the largest deep-water port in northeastern Russia, exporting gold, silver, tin and oil. Magadan's rough beauty, however, betrays a dark history. The city was the administrative center of Stalin's Kolyma Arctic death camps, the gulags, a vast system of work camps and prisons in Siberia through which millions were imprisoned and perished from exposure, starvation and execution between 1932 and 1954. An estimated 2 million people died. To tell us more, it's my great privilege to welcome Father Michael Shields, founder of the Brothers of the Heart of Jesus community in Magadan, Russia. Father Michael, thank you for being with us here today on our program.
It's a pleasure being with you, Mark.
Father, you were born in Alaska. Can you tell us a little bit about your youth?
I had a youth that was incredible. I was raised in small villages. We had even a dog sled. I was raised on moose meat. I lived a fantastic youth.
You were an outdoors person.
Very much so, very much. Mountain climber, fisherman, hunter, all those things.
You climbed the highest mountain in
I climbed Mount McKinley when I was 40 years old.
You attached yourself to the dog and off you went.
That was part of it, yeah. It was 30 days of a climb.
You were ordained in 1979 and you worked for years as a priest, but then you came to, let's say, a crisis in your vocation.
It was.
Can you tell us just a bit about that?
Sure. I'm a priest 32 years. Most of my time as a priest now has been spent in Russia, but for the first 10 years of my life, I was a pastor in Anchorage Archdiocese. I think the crisis happens like in many vocations. You come to a place where you've done everything, what is new, and there was a flame in my heart that felt like it was becoming less. And on a retreat, I heard the words, "Go pray in the camps." And I'd been to Russia once in 1989, falling in and out of love with Magadan, a very cold and harsh environment, and the people as well were difficult. I knew not the language nor the culture. And so during this retreat, I found myself being called back into this call to pray in the camps, to live this culture, to live with the emerging suffering church of Russia. And so then I went back.
And this was already a challenge because you in fact, upon your first visit, you didn't want to go there.
During the retreat, when I heard "Go pray in the camps," at that moment I felt like this can't be from God, because there was not a desire in my heart to go back. In fact, there was fear. And I said to my retreat director, I said, "This can't be from God. I want you to do an exorcism to get this idea out of my heart, because there's no way I want to go back to Magadan, Russia specifically, and Magadan specifically." So he said, "No, let's just pray it." And eventually what happened was, during this retreat, 40-day retreat silence, it was affirmed, and the fear left and the joy came, and the joy has been there ever since. God has given me a great call to be in the midst of this church that's emerging from its dark, dark history into the light of Christ, and I'm part of that.
You arrived in Magadan for the second time on the feast day of Our Ladies of Sorrows in 1994.
Yes.
Is this date significant?
Well, of course.
For you?
Magadan is a place of suffering. It's the suffering in the prison camps. And Our Lady of Sorrows, she is the patron of Magadan specifically, I think generally of Russia. Our Lady is deeply loved in Russia. And I think there's more feast days and icons of Our Lady than any, even of Jesus, her son. She holds people there in Magadan, I think, a special way, because she holds the martyrs, those who gave their life to
in the gulags,
gulag for their faith. And I think we even have what's called Our Lady of Magadan, where she's holding Jesus after his crucifixion. Many of the Russian artists and poets, the believers, would call Magadan the Golgotha of Russia.
So it was almost, if you will, the Auschwitz, what Auschwitz was to Europe, Magadan was to Russia.
I think people, when they say Magadan in Russia, they would have the same reaction as a person in Germany would say Auschwitz, or a person throughout the world. They know the symbol. It's a symbol of the suffering of that time. Magadan is the symbol of the suffering of the prison camps.
What was your emotional impression when you first arrived in Magadan?
In 1989, when I first came, Perestroika had just come. I was one of the first Americans actually come on a friendship flight. And it was both an incredible mystery to me. There was a joy, and then there was a harshness that I wasn't prepared for. And I think now looking back, probably the harshness came from that spiritual awareness that something very evil had happened here.
A weight on the people.
An awakened truth.
But a weight on the people, or how do you feel it in the people?
It's very much like you feel when you come into a cloudy day. There's an oppression. And I think as I became more spiritually awake in Magadan, I realized that spiritual oppression was real. It comes from its own history of the death and the suffering of the people.
Now you became involved with what is now known as the repressed.
Yeah.
Can you tell us who are the repressed, and how was it that you first came in contact with them?
Okay, the repressed is a Russian word for those who suffered in the prison camps. Repressed meaning, obviously in English it's very easily understood, those who were repressed, those who lost their life. Really, they were arrested usually at a very young age, sent to the prison camps to mine gold or other minerals. And many of them believers, so they were arrested and probably for political reasons. They were called political prisoners. And many of them got sentences any from 10 years to 25 years in the prison camps. A 10-year sentence was really a death sentence. So anything beyond 10 years that people survived was really miraculous, anything even up to 10 years. And I got involved with them actually because the call was to pray in the camps. Obviously I knew people who had been in the camps. I didn't know that there are people in Magadan still surviving after the prison camps. Because they were exiled, they had to stay in Magadan, raise their families. And a young woman who was doing her doctoral dissertation came. She was a young Catholic woman, and started introducing me to these men and women who had never realized that there were others in the prison camp in Magadan surviving.
So they had been more or less marginalized.
Their family didn't even know they were in the prison camps. They didn't even talk about their past because it was a scandal even to that day.
Now where would they, just to give a bit of background, where would these people have come from? Because they weren't obviously local inhabitants.
No, because Magadan was a city that was based in the prison camps. Its very existence was a holding camp for the Kolyma region. Many of them came from the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, some from Poland, actually many from Poland. And that when Stalin wanted to prevent the Western influence, he wanted to clear out the Baltic countries. And many of those countries are obviously very strong Catholic countries. And so he would, as far as we understood, there would be a quota, and a quota would be given to a certain community. They wanted a certain amount of young men and young women at a certain age, because they would be the workers of the camp. And so these were arrested for pretenses to fill the prison camps.
So either political or academic intellectuals, and then the believers.
The believers. And I think we have a couple of history books on the prison camps that the witnesses of the people, and there are all kinds of reasons, from involvement with the nationalists to having a religious feast day at home. So, but mostly it was just to clear out that Western influence and to persecute the church.
Now, what, if you could describe for us, what would these people have encountered when they arrived for the first time in Magadan?
Well, many of them, first of all, when they were arrested, they were, say, for instance, in Ukraine, were arrested and they spent maybe 2 months traveling by train. Already many dying along the way for lack of food and harsh environment. Each way, they wouldn't know where they were going. Nobody would tell them where they were going. And eventually they would end up on the coast of Vladivostok, Okhotsk, and they describe a sea of humanity, literally hundreds of thousands at times in this area. And they would say at this time they would be speaking of where would they go from here, then by boat from Vladivostok to Magadan. Again, many of them would be dying on the boat travel. They would be in the hull of the boat. Now they would be arrested with the same clothes that they had. They would not be given new clothes. Now they have, for a couple of months, be traveling. They'd be already winter time, so people would be dying of exposure.
Because we're
2,000 to
talking
5,000 people in a boat, in a hull of a boat.
2,000 to 5,000 people crammed together.
Crammed together.
And when they arrived in Magadan, because Magadan is a very harsh environment, we're talking about winters where it can drop down to minus 40 below.
Absolutely.
And they were literally sent just to mine the gold and to mine.
And so they would talk about. They would come off the boat. Many of the people, many would have already died on the process. They come off the boat, walking into the water. There was no boards to walk on to get to the shore. Many of them would have to travel or would walk into the cold, harsh environment. And initially, like in October, it's already winter time. They would have summer clothes. They were given they were in the holding camps, and then eventually marked out to be grouped. And those groups then would be sent to the different prison camps after that.
I want to ask you a little bit about the spirituality and how these people lived their spirituality, because as you say, many were Catholics, either Greek Catholics or Latin Rite, being exiled to Magadan. How did they live their faith in the camps?
When we did interviews, I've done probably about 100 interviews or more interviews with these men and women. They speak only of one clear, or actually two clear realities. One is the prayer. They always prayed. They prayed quietly, usually not even moving their lips because they would be suspect. The other is that they had, when the possibility of being together in a group, that they would support each other in their faith. One woman said she'd never have more incredible Easter experience than in the camps, where the guards would turn the other way. They had to save some of their bread. They would collect their bread and make Pasch, which is an Easter bread. And the Orthodox and the Catholics and even the Jews that were in the camp would celebrate the Pasch together in unity.
And as you say, the guards would turn their backs.
At that moment, they would have a little bit of freedom to celebrate their faith. But most of the time was very guarded.
Yes, and they were if they were caught praying, they would be punished.
Punished or killed. Another 10-year sentence.
Many of them made rosaries from the bread.
One particular woman that is a very close friend of mine, Branislava, she's a Latvian. She chose to not eat the bread, but to at times make the bread rosaries, which you would combine with some ash from the small stoves in their barracks, and at night would make these small beads, let them dry, then use the thread from her mattress with a fishbone needle to sew the beads together, and then she would sew those into the hem of her garment, and she would catechize. When she would have the opportunity, she would go through the mysteries of the rosary with those around her. And can you imagine now, you're in the prison camps and you talk about the glorious mysteries and you talk about the joyful mysteries. But can you imagine when they talk about the sorrowful mysteries, it would be very much a reality.
The reality they were living.
Yeah. So the mysteries of faith were celebrated there, especially through the mysteries of the Rosary.
In a museum, you're building a small museum. You have also a small bark text written on bark, spiritual texts written on bark.
Oftentimes they would have nothing when they came. And so the men and the women would have prayers memorized to their native language. And when they were out, like Branislava, she worked in the camp that was cutting lumber to make camps. So she would be sawing lumber. And they have birch barks. And you take the birch bark and you trim the birch bark, and it actually is like papyra. It's something you could write on. So that they would make these birch bark prayer. They would write their prayers that they would memorize, or parts of Scripture or parts of the Eucharist, and have a prayer book. And so you'd have these small prayer books. Again, small because you had to hide it. You couldn't keep a very large prayer book. But she kept it for her whole 10-year sentence.
How do you understand this spiritually, this time of cross, this passion of these people in Magadan?
Well, I think, first of all, the church has been persecuted from the very beginning. And the first deacon was murdered for his faith. I think the seeds of the martyrs is really the foundation of the church. And so there's a great nobility, actually. And two things always astound me when I do interviews with these people in the prison camps. First of all, their faith. How faith survives. You know, many of us, our faith is shattered if we don't have a good cup of coffee in the morning.
Yes, but that's important, I mean.
But that's important, of course. But then the abuse of them, the lack of human dignity that was shown them, and yet in their hearts was not bitterness. They tell me the only thing that they would survive on is forgiveness. So they had to forgive constantly the abuse and the reality of their dignity being taken from them, or they would not survive.
Which brings me to the next question, which is that Magadan today is made up mostly of the survivors of the prison camps and those who are guarding them. How do you see this sense? Is there reconciliation happening between these communities?
Well, first of all, I think Magadan is made up of other communities too, because later on the pioneer movement came, and that was to civilize the area. But those that were survived after the prison camps, now you're talking about people in the late 70s and 80s now, so many of them have gone home to God. It's, again, something that wasn't spoken. So you might be living next to somebody who was on the other side of the fence, you might say.
And you wouldn't know.
And you wouldn't know. So when we came and we decided to do an open invitation, I was very naive at that time, and I just did literally a public invitation to those who were in the prison camps. Now this is the 1990s. And I put it in the paper, and everybody looked at me very surprised, like, how can you do this? Well, I didn't know any better. So I invited him to the local public library, and 80 people showed up.
Suddenly.
That had been in the prison camps, that met maybe for the first time and said, you were in Butu Gachag in 1943. You were in Barrack 5. And they were met, and I saw tears, I saw recognition, I saw a sense of shared suffering and a freedom that started happening. They were very afraid to speak. It took 5 to 6 years for them to tell their story. And then later on, they would proclaim it. And so I saw a real change of conversion in our work with them.
You've made a Martyrs chapel now. Why and what inspired you to do this?
Well, again, my response, they have a monument in Magadan to those who were repressed. It's called the Mask of Sorrows. It's one of the only monuments to the prison camps in Russia. And yet, most people say that it's more Soviet feel than...
It's an ugly construction.
It's a large obelisk. And so when I realized what these people were talking about, many of the people were believers, that they needed a place to pray or a place that would recognize their faith. So I made an addition to the chapel, to our own church, something that was not in the plan, and it just came to me that we needed to have a place to pray. And that chapel now is called the Chapel of the Martyrs. It has crosses on a rock wall for those who died in the camps. But mostly for me, it's a place of prayer. So I pray before the Blessed Sacrament in the morning and the evening in that chapel for those who suffered and for those who are coming out of the emerging church in Russia, out of the suffering church.
You are a member of the follower of the community of Brother Charles de Foucault.
Yes.
Can you tell us, how would you compare the spirituality of Brother Charles in the desert to your spirituality, what you encountered in Siberia, in this new desert, if you will?
My heart's always been with Brother Charles. I was ordained with his abandonment prayer on my ordination card, and I have been a member of Jesu Caritas, which is a diocesan priesthood spirituality. And somewhere along the line, when the Russian vocation came, I felt like God was really asking me to put on the outside what was on the inside. So I took private vows with my bishop, and tried to live the spirituality of Brother Charles. Brother Charles is a contemplative life in the middle of the world. His love for the extreme probably is very much my love for Russia. His ability to pray in different and varying situations and to pray deeply. His love for the Eucharist. Those are all parts of my experience in the Siberian desert.
you've made yourself a pustina,
Yeah.
which is, perhaps you can explain better than I, but a place of prayer where you retreat, if you will,
Yeah.
from the world. How do you live your faith, if you will, in Magadan?
Well, I think, again, much like the prison camp survivors, I wouldn't be there unless I didn't pray. It's not a place where you can play your Christianity. You can play with it. You've got to be serious. The spiritual reality is very much there. You can still feel the spiritual battle. And so when I went there, I came with a real clear sense of needing to be with God in quiet, in a postinik, they call it. And postinia is a small house dedicated to prayer and fasting, reading the scriptures. Many would say it's once a month. I go once a week. On a Monday, usually I'm in postinia. It's not so much as it could be called a refreshment, but mostly it's just asking God for a word, asking God for direction, asking God for what He wants. And I think that's kind of a surrendered spirituality of Brother Charles. Abandonment to God's will is really is the spirituality that I understand best in my life.
And Saint Therese of Lisieux also plays an important place in your spirituality.
Saint Therese, we brought her relics through Russia in the late 90s, 99 and 2000, I believe. And her small way, her little way, which is really trusting in the Father, I think is for me also, I can't see living in any other way. The other thing about Brother Charles, and I think about Teresa as well, is they're both failure saints. They're for the little people, for the people who are not going to be doing a whole lot for them in their life. And I find myself, that's the kind of saint I like. I can fail and fail well.
You mentioned earlier a spiritual battle, and I want to come to talk about this question about the young people today in Russia. How do you find this spiritual battle being played out? Is there a search for God? How do you see the young people today in Russia?
Well, I think the young people in Russia have an incredible future if they find themselves turning to God. There's three obviously major issues that Russia is dealing with, and I suspect it's not anything new because Europe is dealing with it: secularism, faith, family realities, and then I think relationship with other religions, so for instance, Islam. So the young people really, they can become very secularized very quickly. In fact, you might say that Russia moved from a communist influence, anti-God, to almost a secular influence, anti-God. And if they didn't catch God in between those two movements, I think there's a huge danger that Russia will continue to be godless, if you would. So the role of the church is very important. The role of the church is to say, God has to be there in the center of your life, or it will be as empty as it was before. And so the young people that I have in the parish are incredible young people because they've made really statements of faith and have have this relationship with God. That means they're morally, they have some kind of compass, a moral compass. They have a community of faith that supports them. They have families that pray with them. So they have all those necessary items to be good Christians.
You talked about family issues, and one of course, the biggest scourges that Russia has encountered is abortion.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the scourge itself and why so prevalent in Russia? And secondly, what is it that you are doing in response to this scourge?
Well, Russia was the first country to legalize abortion. It set this whole theme of the desecration of life in the womb. And then it was the first country to make it illegal. And then now it's back, of course, after perestroika, to a horrendous amount of abortions, legally and illegal.
It's almost like a birth control.
They talk about it as birth control. Many of the women would have multiple abortions, not unusual to have 10, say. And so when life is so cheapened, when a mother destroys the child in the womb, something breaks in humanity. And so there's a real brokenness in Russia because of that. So there's two things that have to be done. First of all, an encouragement to have children. And surprisingly, the government is in panic right now
because of the
demographics right now is so horrible that they are paying people to have children, a second child. They are limiting abortions like they've never done before. but that won't work unless there's a moral foundation.
Yes.
You can't pay somebody to have a child. So our job is to make this moral foundation of the sacredness of life. So we have programs to educate, we have programs to support young women who want to have a child. And then the other side is you have to heal the heart. And so we have what's called Rachel's Vineyard. It's a lovely healing retreat for women who have aborted their child. In Russia, it's a very difficult question because it's not been brought to the surface.
Yes, not officially recognized.
Not officially recognized. And so now it's officially recognized in our parish. And what's interesting is we have now 2 retreats a year, and there's a women's group that developed out of that meet on Thursdays to deal with the issues that raises up.
Post-abortion syndrome. And
the post-abortion syndrome, relationships with themselves, with their family, with their living children, with their husband. There's much healing that has to be done. So I think the Church of Russia today, the Catholic Church of Russia today, has to do an incredible job of healing. And
that's where you feel yourself called.
That's where I feel I'm called.
What would you say is your greatest need?
My greatest need probably is in this area, is to encourage and to make more evident through publicity, through help for the women who have these young children, through these. We want to do Rachel Vineyard throughout Russia. We want to send people, kind of missionaries, to do this healing. So I think that area is my greatest need. It's certainly the priority that I see. When I see a child in front of me, and we have a monthly meeting of these women who've decided not to abort their child, and there are 30 children in front of me. It's a living letter of God. There is a life that we've saved.
Father Michael Shields, thank you for having been with us today on our program.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having been with us today on Where God Weeps. And if you'd like to know more about the work of Father Michael Shields in the far east of Russia, in Magadan, or perhaps how you might be able to help, I would encourage you to look at the contact information at the end of this program. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.